Well, I did it. Despite some questionable packaging, I survived Fadergate and managed to get a working unit. It's been interesting to watch all the hype generated by this little guy, with internet forums buzzing to thousands of replies within days, watching all the haters and fanboys rushing to the scene to battle for internet supremacy. I may or may not have participated in said battle. But back in the real world, where we actually use our toys rather than just argue about them, I've had an incredibly satisfying experience. I can say with confidence that this is one of the most immediate and fun samplers I've ever used, and I think this little calculator may actually live up to the hype and be a huge hit, Fadergate aside. I'm Donald Jordan for Bloom Music, and this is the Teenage Engineering EP-133 K.O. I've never really been interested in Teenage Engineering's other offerings. The pocket operators and OP1 are a little too toyish for my taste. I've always found the company's ethos a little gimmicky. But I was very interested when the K.O. was announced. It's a striking, bold design and the interface is primed for immediacy. After actually getting my hands on it, I found that it's an absolute blast. So I wanted to share my experiences, some workflow ideas, and also talk about an extremely powerful feature that I think has been mostly overlooked. But first, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, quality. Judging by the sentiment of some very vocal users on the forums, I was expecting the K.O. to disintegrate into a pile of plastic rubble and PCB shards the first time I played the pads. As it turns out, the build quality is actually perfectly fine, and if I hadn't been reading so much about it, it never would have even entered my mind as a concern. But despite my real-world experience with the device, users online refused to believe and instead insisted that the only way to truly determine the quality of the K.O. would be to test it using the standard by which all gear has traditionally been measured, by dropping it from an extreme height. So today, I'll perform the drop test. To start, we'll need a drop performance baseline. So for that, I'll be using the undisputed king of the drop test, the MPC. Now, as I understand it, this device was actually constructed at the behest of the gods in the same forge as Thor's hammer. So obviously a unit of such extreme quality will survive unscathed. Oh, shit. Now that I think about it, since I'm a functioning adult who hasn't randomly dropped a single device in 25 years of frequent gear use, I think I'll observe the K.O.'s quality from a less extreme perspective. In all seriousness, the quality is absolutely fine. The device has some nice heft to it and is super rigid despite its slab-like form factor. When measured against its closest competitors, it has a similar weight, despite being about a third the thickness. It's a much more dense device, and that definitely benefits the perceived quality. I can grab the corners and twist with force, and the body doesn't flex or creak. But it does bow in the middle under heavy pressure when using the punch effects due to the elevating feet on the corners. Additionally, Teenage Engineering opted to use cherry switches for the pads. I can see how someone who is not a keyboard aficionado may find these clicky keys odd or cheap feeling compared to the soft, expressive pads on most Groove devices, but as a total mechanical keyboard nerd, I love the overlap of my two hobbies here. The clacking of the keys as I tap in a beat is a fun, unique experience. And as far as quality goes, these mechanical switches are rated for 100 million presses before any perceivable reduction in performance. So you'll be opening up your MPC to replace the pad sensors right about the time you're getting these bad boys broken in. Overall, I find the quality of the device perfectly fine, but make sure and get your hands on one and try it out yourself rather than trusting the opinions of randos on the internet. Now, it's not all roses and sunshine with the K.O. so I wanted to share some of my major concerns with the device. There are obvious workflow things that are a little frustrating, but let's be honest, in our release it now and finish it later software culture, that's every device these days, and these are the types of things we can expect to be incrementally improved via firmware updates. But my main concerns with the device are with the hardware. Now, normally I would prefer real pots on a device, but in this case, encoders would have been the better choice. Pots make sense for knob per function instruments, but when you have two knobs that control something different on every single screen or function, it becomes a headache. Teenage Engineering implemented a catch-up feature to help, but because the knobs have no visual indication of their current position, and the position indicator on the screen is approximate at best, every knob tweak is just a shot in the dark. It's a major case of form over function, and the results are disappointing. When you're trying to adjust very fine parameters like chop points, the knobs are barely usable. My other hardware concern is this screen. Now, overall, it's stunning to look at, and I love the aesthetic. But, pretty blinky light fixation aside, the display gets a little too cutesy sometimes. Here again, Teenage Engineering has chosen form over function. You want to make swing a little boxer guy? That's fine, at least it's on theme and I can live with that. But there is a universal symbol for undo. It's even used elsewhere on this very device. So why then does it have to be an umbrella on the screen? It's not enough to remember all the shift functions, now I have to remember what umbrella means too? It's not a huge deal, but again, they've chosen a more artsy form over function approach with some of these icons, so that does impact the learning curve a little bit. Obviously, neither of these issues are deal breakers for me, but I wanted to call them out because unfortunately, as they are both hardware concerns, they're not something that can be addressed via firmware, so you'll need to be prepared to live with them. There's lots to love with this workflow if you're an old school MPC fan. I think the general workflow of the K.O. is pretty well documented on YouTube at this point, so this won't really be a deep dive, more just a high-level overview of my personal workflow and maybe some tips and tricks. The first thing I did when I got the device was delete all of the stock samples and load my own. Nothing against the factory samples, they're actually pretty good, but I'm not really a one-shot guy. I like to work with loops and breaks. To save space, I used an old school sampler trick and sped up the samples before loading them on the device, so all of my samples are double time. Not only does this take up half as much space, but it also means I get some nice grit when I pitch down the sample an octave to get the original timing and pitch. Here's an example of the difference. On this pad, I have a sample loaded in at double time. Now I pitch it down an octave and I get the original speed and pitch. Now on this pad, I have the original sample loaded in at the normal speed. Listen to the difference in character. The pitch down sample isn't quite as grimy as you'd get with a 1200, but it definitely has a vibe. I work with breaks because I like that old school hip hop sound, but this workflow also adds a lot of versatility. I can kind of break down the loops into whatever granularity I need. So let's just say I want to get a quick loop going that I can jam over. It's as simple as selecting a sample, pitching it down an octave, setting the BPM to match, and then making sure it's in one-shot mode. Now I've got a perfectly looping sample. Now let's say I like the vibe of this break, but I want to mix up the flow a little bit by chopping it up. I just hit chop, wait for the playthrough, which I do wish was an option to turn off. I don't like to sit here and wait for it to play before I can start. But once it's played through, I can start chopping. And now I can take that same break and make something new out of it. Now let's say I like these sounds, but I want to really do my own thing with them, and I want only the one-shots. Again, I just hit chop, and I can grab the one-shots I want. I've seen some complaints online that the lazy chopping should be a tap and not a hold, like the new NPCs, but I don't agree. It's great for grabbing single hits. Now I've got an easy kick, snare, and hat. And then of course I can clean up these start and end points if I was a little sloppy. So that's why I like working from breaks. It gives me the versatility to work however I want, whether that be by loops, chops, or one-shots. I can go anywhere. It's just a very versatile approach for me, and the K.O.'s workflow and super simple chopping make it very easy. Here's a couple quick tips to support this workflow. I've already talked about how big of a pain it is to set your start and end points with the knobs. Thankfully, there's a second method for doing this. When you're in the trim mode, Shift and the plus or minus buttons adjust your start or end point. So if you've got a pad like this where the snare hit starts a little early, I just go into my sound edit mode, make sure the trim selection is selected, and then I can use Shift and the plus minus buttons to fix my start point. Another quick tip if you're working with loops is to name your files so that the last 3 characters of the file name are the BPM. When you're in the sound menu, you can see your file name by holding down the pad, but it scrolls by really quickly and it can be difficult to catch the BPM in the file name. But the display always holds on the last 3 characters of the file name regardless of length. So put your BPM at the end and you'll always be able to clearly tell what your file tempo is. So now we get into the meat and potatoes of why I'm really excited about this device. Sure, a modern MPC 3000 is cool, but you know what's even cooler? A modern SK1. SK1s maintain a cult status because there's never really been a good modern reinterpretation. Enter the K.O. which gets you from this to this. True old-school polyphonic chromatic sampling. Groovebox functionality aside, if this was all this little calculator did, it would still be worth the price of admission for me. This type of sampling is dear to me and is kind of a forgotten dark art. But this old school method of slowing down and stretching samples to their limit produces some of the most beautiful, organic sounds, just dripping with texture. And of course, this plays into the low memory kind of classic nature of the K.O. I don't really mind that it only has 64 megabytes because a huge lush pad sample is just a handful of kilobytes. But really, no one is seriously getting this thing to be a studio centerpiece to make full tracks. I mean, it has 9 project slots, and polyphony will become an issue, especially if you're working with stereo files. So as I've said, this falls more into the jamming category than the production tool category. And in that capacity, I basically use it as a preset machine for all my favorite synth patches. So when I go to jam with my friends, all they need to do is throw my Launchpad and the K.O. into a laptop bag, and I'm good to go. For that, it's perfect. The K.O. is an intriguing instrument at a competitive price point. I've owned pretty much every modern sampler available, and this has been the most immediately approachable and fun of the bunch, even if it's not as feature-rich. But we're talking $300 here. I've seen a lot of complaints online about missing features compared to samplers that cost 2, 3, 4 times as much, and I'm like, well, yeah. Duh. But if you look beyond spec sheets and actually get your hands on the device, it's a super fun and engaging experience. It's not perfect though, and some of the interface decisions constantly remind you that it's made by a company called Teenage Engineering rather than Teenage Musicians. But the joy of use overcomes these annoyances. But where the device really shines for me is in the SK1-ness of it all. Finally, an instrument that can quickly and intuitively give me polyphonic sample playback with all of the grit and texture of yesteryear. For that alone, the K.O. is a keeper.